As I was wrestling with this week, these passages, I was wrestling with, on the one hand, we talk about, kind of the call into ministry that people like me have, to where it's this very specific call, and it's doing these very specific things. But I also believe that in each of our own ways, that God calls us to be a part of whatever it is our lives. And even in Jesus' time, he went and he called Simon and Andrew and James and John, and they left their boats behind. But most of the people who Jesus interacted with, they stayed with their homes, with their families, with their farms, with their vacations, and they still were able to, in their own way, serve God there. And so, and I do believe in our own lives that, yes, there are people who maybe understand their life, their calling. Hey, this is what I do, and this is what God has gifted me to do, and it's not just pastors that do this. I mean, whether it's teachers or social workers or people working at a bank or whatever it happens to be, whatever your job is, that can be a place where you serve God, and it can be a place where you say, but here are where my gifts are, and here's where God has equipped me to do what it is I do. And we all, in our own way, I mean, we are all called into the body of Christ. We are all called in our baptism. We are set aside, and I love the language of the Psalms, where it talks about, even in my mother's womb, you knit me together. From the very beginning, even before we're born, God knows us and God understands who we are. And for example, Jeremiah, when he's called, God can say, in your mother's womb I called you. That from the very beginning, God knows us and knows who we are. And I think sometimes we look, and again, I sometimes come in and I have put together the slides earlier in the week, and I come together in on Sunday and it's like, what was I thinking with a particular slide? This was one of those slides. I think where I was going again was the idea of, sometimes we get to where our lives are preparation for certain things, but as I started thinking about it and I started looking at the slide, if you run, that's a sprinter's pose. That's not a long distance. For a sprinter's pose, you're down in the racks, because those first few steps make all the difference in the world. But if anything, what we do in life is much more of a long distance run, to where, you're going to have times where you stumble along the way, but it's keeping that one foot in front of the other and keeping going along that. And I do come from a particular perspective. I'm a person who was called into ministry, and I think that's part of my life is also to help all of us understand what all of our lives are. But I can also share some times and some experiences in that, because there are those times where you're called and you don't have control. I do firmly believe that, eventually, if God is calling you to do something, eventually you will do it, because God will outweigh you. But anyways, as I was thinking about Jonah this week, it brought back to mind a memory from when I was in seminary. And they talk about when you get to your last year of seminary, you're assigned, and you don't get to choose where you're going first. You're assigned. So you're assigned to a region of the country, and so we're part of what's called Region 4. So there's 9 regions of the United States as far as the church breaks it down. And where I went to seminary in Iowa, you typically went to 3, 4, or 5. So 3 is the 2 Dakotas and Minnesota. 4 is Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin, much smaller areas because there's a lot of Lutherans up there. And then Region 4 is Nebraska all the way down to Texas. And so we got together, and we are getting ready to receive our assignments to which region we're going into, and we're having lots of fun with this. And so we talk about receiving a call to Nineveh, North Dakota, and being from Texas and growing up in San Antonio, I had my own little rendition of, instead of Amarillo by morning, it was North Dakota by morning. And if somebody's a North Dakota person, I apologize. It's a great place, but it was just one of these things. We were having a lot of fun with it, and then we all received where we were going, to which region, and then to which synod we got assigned, and we learned where we were going. And again, sometimes you end up going where you didn't want to go, and that's part of the story of Jonah. So Jonah was called by God, go to Nineveh. Now, it wasn't that Nineveh was Nineveh was where Jonah didn't want to go, because those were the people who had conquered his his nation, and he didn't want to go and proclaim that because he knew God would be gracious. So he went the other way. Nineveh's in modern day Iraq. He went towards modern day Spain, as far from the ends of the earth, as far as he knew it at that point, as far away as from where God was calling him. And so most of you know the story that he's resisting God's call, and so God, while he's on the ship, sends the winds and the waves, and the sailors do everything they can to save him and save the ship. And finally, they take Jonah's advice and they throw him into the sea, and everything becomes calm. And I love this picture by James C. Christensen. He said, well, if I was God and I was going to do this for Jonah, I would create a really cool fish. So this is the really cool fish. But anyway, so Jonah is there for 3 days in the whale or the fish's belly, and then spit up on the land. And where we're here today in chapter 3 is where God says, "Now I'm calling you again, go to Nineveh." God has outweighted Jonah. And Jonah goes, and Jonah goes and proclaims, and the people hear, and they turn. And God also turns. God says, well, I'm not going to bring on them the calamity that I was going to bring on them. Part of that is that there are those times where, you go to those places and you maybe it's in the place where you're saying, hey, I have no reason why I want to go there. And sometimes it ends up being the most wonderful blessing you could imagine. I know, again, many years ago when I did my internship, I got my assignment. I was going to Blanchardville, Wisconsin. Blanchardville is a town of 800, and I'm looking on a map. I grew up in San Antonio. I thought when I was in Fort Polk in the Army that was the middle of nowhere. So I'm looking for Blanchardville on the map, and I can't find it. It's a town of 800, and it's a little bitty circle on the map. And so I finally find it. And again, it was 4 Point Parish. Blanchardville was the big town with 800. The smaller town was 200. But I go there, and it was a wonderful experience. They're all Norwegian, but they welcomed me with open arms, and they helped show me what it was to be a pastor. I have all kinds of experiences from that time that I still share. And sometimes it is those places where you don't expect or where you don't want to go that ends up being that great blessing. And sometimes on the flip side is that place where, hey, I'm going to go here. That ends up being sometimes the hard place. But anyways, Jesus comes by the lakeshore. He comes down to the Sea of Galilee. He sees Simon Peter and Andrew, and he sees James and John, and he calls them, and they leave their nets and their boats and their families behind, and they come and they follow him, and they're off on a journey. They don't know what's happening, and I've also often wondered, well, it really doesn't tell us what it is that they know about Jesus or anything else like that of why do they make this journey away from their boats, and ultimately it doesn't tell us. But I have my suspicions, and I know from my own experience of Paul that sometimes all of a sudden things just click and they make sense, and oh yes, this is what I'm supposed to do, and I really do believe that they, like many of the rest of us, they're caught in the nets. They thought they were fishing, and now they're caught in nets themselves, and they're snared, and now they're going to go out and they're going to fish for people. And one of the things, one of the verses, it's a verse that occurs in a lot of funerals. It's part of the funeral service, but it comes out of the book of Romans. It's a verse that I find a lot of hope in. It's Paul writing to the Romans. He says, "We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die to the Lord." Now, yes, at a funeral, that's a great comfort because we know that even in death, the Lord holds us, and that we are that the one who has watched over us all throughout our life continues to watch over and sustain us. But as I was thinking about this, and it's not just pastors; it's all of us. All of us who have been knit together in our mother's wombs by God, all of us who God has known from the very beginning, and who God has called, and who God has used for whatever function that we serve within this world. We all live our lives to the Lord. Every day, every breath, every step is something that we do in this space, in this time that the Lord has given us. And it's a way in which we serve and give back to God. And so, our lives are not our own. That we too have been snared, like Peter and Andrew and James and John. We too have a God who will outweigh us, just like Jonah. We too are people who who live to the Lord. And as we come together, as we celebrate, as we have this time to kind of reflect on who we have been called to be, what are the gifts that God has placed within our lives? What are the vocations that God has given to us? You know, the work that we do, the families that we have, our role as, you know, whether it's mother or father or husband or wife or as a single person trying to make sense of the world or whatever that is, that we don't do that on our own. We're never alone in the midst of that. That the one who has called us from the beginning, who has caught us in his nets, continues to go forward with us. Because whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Our life is the Lord's. And each and every day is a gift that God has given us. So whether that means that we are in Nineveh, North Dakota, or Nineveh, or whether we're here in Frisco and McKinney, you know, this is a day that God has given us to live with. And God has called us and given us gifts for that which we are called to do. And so we go from this knowing that we have been called. We have been caught in the Savior's net. And that our lives are not our own. That whether we live or that whether we die, that we are the Lord's. And this life that we live in the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen.